women only became property in the agricultural age. We can look at current hunter-gatherer societies today to see what it likely was like when all of humans were hunter-gatherers, an era when women could have sex with anyone they liked and people were not property. They were able to move around freely. It was only the advent of agriculture that limited women's sexual freedom and made women into property. And then religion further worked on this to constrain the sexual activities that were acceptable. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't believe in your religion, but there's nothing biological or psychological or economically beneficial to women in this regard. I would say that monogamy is good for society when you have children and to create some order, but if we look at these ancient tribes, we will see that there was no rape, there was no violence, that people got along very well without religion and owning and controlling women. We will look at 3 tribes. I find this very interesting because how could in this modern day and age we could still have people living like prehistoric people? So the first is the Hazda people. They live in the Rift Valley, and they have resisted the movement to agriculture for centuries. They live in very low density population, so they don't really have problems with disease. Violence and murder are rare. And since they move around frequently, they don't have need or want of possessions, and the community is very fluid. The women provide a majority of the calories, and the men provide protein from hunting meat. So, unlike their agricultural neighbors, they store no food and experience no drought because they're always moving around. They have lived in the same area for thousands of years but have hardly left a trace. So this sounds very much like how we imagine our ancient ancestors to have lived. Now, how do they treat women and relationships and sex? In these tribes, the woman is in charge. A man and a woman stay together for a few years, then they split up and find other mates. There is no marriage, there is no divorce. If a woman doesn't like the way a man treats her, she simply leaves him. Now, here's about children, because I hear a lot of guys say, I'm not going to raise anyone's kids, which, by the way, men that I know, they're happy to take on other children. You just take them into the fold, you know? Not like a bunch of barnyard animals, but this whole thing of like, I'm not going to raise someone else's kids. I don't get that. And neither do they. Children are well cared for within the groups, and the men are very concerned with the welfare of the children, and they do not care about paternity. Okay? Men in tribes do not care about paternity. Why? Because children are not property, women are not property. How does a husband control a woman when she provides as much or more of the calories as the man, and she can roam anywhere she likes? So you could say that in the tribal system, it makes sense for women to not be property and for children to not be property, because everyone is concerned with coexisting and social bonding. They don't have possessions, they don't own land, they don't own people, they don't have possessions. So maybe that works for them, and there's a lot of truth in that. I think that monogamy and marriage and divorce and ownership and paternity are things that may be required in an ownership society. But let's continue. Now we're going to look at the Mangaians of Polynesia. They're a fishing and gardening society on an isolated island in the South Pacific. The focus is on sexual pleasure, particularly female satisfaction and multiple orgasms. Romantic love is not linked to sex, and Mangaian youths do not date. Coitus is the expected outcome. And the young Mangaian men average 3 orgasms per night, 7 days a week, and the expectation is that the male will strive to have his partner have 2 to 3 orgasms before each one. So as he becomes sexually active, he's expected to know a great deal about female anatomy. So that's another example. Masturbation is normal and encouraged, and sexual activity is relished as something pleasurable. And finally, we'll talk about the Na hunter-gatherers of China. They're a tribe of 40,000. It's a matriarchal tribe. And in matriarchies, women lead different than men because women are more interested in being cooperative. They're not interested in control. They want harmony. So in this tribe, this is interesting too. It just shows the diversity of our human existence. Men and women don't live together, and fatherhood is unimportant. The child is raised by his mother in the home of the mother, and the male figures are the uncle. So the mother may not even know or care who the father is. So this shows us that humans are not programmed for any particular type of sexual arrangement. Okay? But the major religions have many dogmatic ideas about marriage, child rearing, and sexuality. They proclaim that a child must be raised by two opposite sex parents, that sexual activity before marriage will harm the marriage, and that marriage is essential for the greatest human happiness, and that women must be subordinate to men. But none of these dogmas hold true among these three cultures that we just mentioned. Although I don't think that would work today. I do not think this would work today because people own things. And when people own things and work for their possessions, they want to control things, including the women and the children. Now, I personally don't have the same thing that some of these guys are like, I would never date someone with children. I don't feel that. I would date a guy with children. I love children. And when I was a mom, sometimes we had exchange students. One time we had a foster person living with us, and I treated these people like one of my own kids. I don't get this thing of my flesh and blood, like children are owned. I don't own my children. They are a privilege. I see children more as like little beings that we can influence and prosper and grow, like flowers or trees, something that we can influence to be, they're people that we can influence and teach and mentor, and that is a great satisfaction in that. I don't see the point of having to own them the way that some guys talk about. To me, that's a very strange concept, but let's continue. So there was a transition from the hunter-gatherer to the agricultural society, and farmers, just like the people with guns, got rid of the Indians. The farmers got rid of the hunter-gatherers. They just eliminated them. And a big change in human society came about with the age of agriculture because it was the age of property ownership. And agriculture actually allowed women to have children every 2 years rather than every 4, and children started being used for labor. Farmers had to acquire and defend their land, and all this required a concentration of labor and resources. And also, as this food was grown, many more people could survive on the same amount of land. So the human population really grew, and control of the land depended on control of the children and who would inherit it. And this in turn meant sexual control of the wife. Now, when we talk about the cleanliness of the wife, I know that in the Jewish tradition they practice circumcision for cleanliness. However, a lot of the uncleanliness was prescribed to women who could never become clean. I guess a man could become clean once he was circumcised at birth, but a woman was always considered dirty. And so they have all these rituals of cleanliness, but these have no basis in biology. You might say that this cleanliness was to prevent the spread of disease, but we're not talking about actual cleanliness. We're talking about ritual cleanliness that is based on supernaturalism. Because for the circumcision, they often use unsterilized instruments. And for ritual washing, they used fonts, bowls, or instruments that were never washed. So this ritual cleansing and ritual cleanliness was unrelated to actual sanitary cleanliness. Ritual cleanliness is designed to protect people from contamination from deities and invisible powers and forces, such as when a woman brings 2 doves for a burnt offering. Now, we talked in this other, when I talked about this other book, Women Throughout History, there was a long period of time when women were the head of society, the goddesses, the matriarchal age. And then it took over the age of the phallus and the age of God as man. But with agriculture too, men, that came upon the age of man as the patriarch, as the one in charge. And so women were controlled as property. Women had no rights. They were owned. They were owned first by their fathers, then by their brothers and cousins if there was no more father, and finally her husband when she marries. Ownership. And that's why the man walks his daughter down the aisle in marriage. It's really symbolic of, I own her, I walk her down the aisle, and now I hand her off to you, the husband. When I got married, I refused that. I took my ex-husband's last name, but I did not let my dad walk me down the aisle as if I was some piece of fucking property to be handed off. Fuck that. This is not to say anything bad against people who like that. If you feel close to your dad and you like him walking you down the aisle, that's very sweet. But to me, it symbolized an ownership thing that I did not want to have any part of. And sharing a last name to me, what only made sense, it just is more easy, especially because I plan on having children so that we could all have the same last name. I just thought it made us more of a family. Yes. So that ends this section of the book. And thank you for watching my video. I look forward to reading your comments.